Hey there, I'm Drew, one of the founders of Create. Today we're going to talk about how you can use Create to connect to external APIs. We often get this question, hey, does Create have support for this API? Well, the really powerful thing about Create is that it's just creating code under the hood. So you can connect to almost any API. Let me show you how you can tell if you can connect to the API you have in mind. Here's an API we get asked about all the time, Exa. They do LLM-based search. That means I can enter a query and I can use AI to find the best content on the web for it. So they have an API, but can I use this in Create? Another API we get asked about is Stripe. Stripe is a very famous API, and you might want to use the Stripe API to do something in your Create apps. The first things I always take a look for is the docs. Once I see the docs, there's three things I'm trying to look for. One, what is the authentication of the API? And that tells me how to get secret keys in Create. Two, what is the endpoint that I'm actually trying to hit, and do they have an example? And then three, what is the inputs to the API and what do I want to return as outputs from my Create app? So when I go to the Exa docs, I can kind of see that they have a section here called search. And usually I look for two things on the docs page. I quickly scan to see, okay, what's the endpoint that this is doing? So this is a search endpoint. And then I look to see, do they have any example requests? You'll see that sometimes they show you these example requests to different code libraries. What tends to work well in Create is look to see if they have an example curl request. Go ahead and copy that. And then I also think that a really fast way to tell Create about a particular endpoint, if you don't want to read, is just to go ahead and take a screenshot of the docs page. So here I'm using an extension called Go Full Screen. I'm going to go ahead and copy that as a screenshot. And I copied the curl request to my clipboard. So I should have everything I need to tell Create how to actually talk to the search API. I could read this, but I'll skip for now. Over in Create, we're going to go ahead and make a new function in order to talk to APIs. Functions are pretty powerful. They're just backend serverless, functions, which means that they generate the code that can run in the cloud and can actually go ahead and hit your API. What's cool is that functions can have secrets and that you can test them with their inputs, their outputs on your own to see that it's actually hitting your API before you go ahead and integrate that function with the rest of your Create app. So with my new function, I'm going to describe what I want. This function is going to take in a search term. It's going to hit the Exa API, and then it's going to return research papers from Exa. You'll see that if I just generate this, Create actually does a pretty bad job of understanding how to do this because Create doesn't know about the Exa API. So if I look under the hood, it'll generate me a diagram of what it's going to try. You'll see that it's going to take in a search term. It's going to try to grab data from the Exa API, and then it's going to throw an error if needed and be done. Under the hood, what Create's doing is it's creating code. And if I just examine the code, I can see what's kind of wrong. First of all, it guesses a URL endpoint that it seems to have just made up. Second, it doesn't have any API keys, and so it lets you enter them here. And so let's go ahead and grab the context that I got from the Exa API to make this a lot better. First, I'm going to go ahead and say, here's an example request. And I'm just going to paste in my curl request. Create's going to use this, and it's going to learn a lot about how to actually stick this into the Exa API. Second, I'm going to tell Create, here's the full docs. And I'll go ahead and stick my image in of the docs. Create can understand images, and so here Create will use the actual image docs to actually stick and write the code for my function. And then finally, when I'm writing functions, I want to make sure I always describe three things. What are the inputs, right? What do I want my function to take in? What does it do, right? And so in this case, it's going to be hit the Exa API. And then what are the outputs, right? What do I want to return? And for now, I'm going to say research paper from Exa. And then I usually give it any helpful details, right? Which is like the request and the docs. Now if I regenerate it, Create's going to nail it. You'll see that when I look at the underlying code, that it's actually picked up a lot of information from the curl request and the docs. It actually has the exact endpoint that seems right, which is the Exa URL. It has the exact API key, and it seems to have cleaned up some of the code. One last note, it's usually not safe to keep API keys just in the raw code. It means that anybody who views this project could go ahead and grab that API key. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the secrets manager, and I'm going to go ahead and say Exa API key, and I'm going to stick my secret key in and save it as a secret. And then I'm going to regenerate the function. And now what you'll notice is that Create will actually update the function to use my API key and my secret key. All right, let's test it out. So over here in the test tab, they have an input field. I can press psychology and we can go ahead and run the function, which will use psychology as my search term for my function. All right, when I go ahead and see that it's run, I can view the details and see that it ran, but we actually have an error. Just one tip when you get errors like this, Create actually puts the logs of what's going on for your error. And so one really fast thing you can do is you can just copy and paste the logs, go back to your prompt, and add a little section called fix, and then stick whatever you want in the logs. Then go ahead and regenerate your prompt, and you'll see that Create will actually go ahead and update it. So if you're not technical, that's a really fast way to go ahead and see what's in the error. In this case, it said that there's some header that we don't have. So after I regenerate, if I look at the code, I'm pretty sure that Create will have fixed it. And sure enough, it puts this header. But if you're not technical, you don't have to worry about that. Just drop your error in and say, fix this, and regenerate, and then go ahead and test your function again. So we're going to go ahead and search for psychology papers. And there we go. We get all the results from this API. And the cool thing is that now we can go ahead and use this function to do whatever we want. So you'll see that the X API returns ID, URL, score, title, author, published date. You can always go back to your spec and tell the function to just return a subset of the information that the API gives you. So in this case, I'm going to only return the URL, the authors, the title, and the date. And maybe that's just the subset that I need to build my app in Create. All right, and now if we run another test, like machine learning, we will see that we only get back a subset of the information from our API because our function does some more processing on top of the API's work. From here, we can do a ton of things. We can use other functions. We can use any of our built-in integrations. So for example, I could go ahead and analyze the paper with ChatGPT just by referencing it in the menu, or I could store the results in a database using a built-in database. And so functions are really powerful to connect to APIs. Those are all the steps to connect to any external API. If you remember, we did 3 things. We figured out what the authentication method was. We figured out what the endpoint was, what our inputs and outputs should be, and then we went ahead and made a function for it in Create. Now that we have that function and it's tested and working, we can use it in any other part of our Create app. But hopefully this gives you inspiration of how you can connect to any arbitrary API, not just the ones we have as built-in integrations in Create. Happy building.